The Lessons of the Past by Edith Hamilton. Is there an ever-present past? Are there permanent truths which are forever important for the present? Today, we're facing a future more strange and untried than any other generation has faced. The new world Columbus opened seems small indeed beside the illimitable distances of space before us, and the possibilities of destruction are immeasurably greater than ever. In such a position, can we afford to spend time on the past? That is a question I'm often asked. Am I urging the study of the Greeks and Romans and their civilizations for the atomic age? Yes, that is just what I'm doing. I urge it without qualifications. We have a great civilization to save or to lose. The greatest civilization before ours was the Greek. They challenge us, and we need the challenge. They too lived in a dangerous world. They were a little highly civilized people, the only civilized people in the West, surrounded by barbarous tribes, and with the greatest Asiatic power, Persia, always threatening them. And in the end, they succumbed. But the reason they did was not that the enemies outside were so strong, but that their own strength, their spiritual strength, had given way. While they had it, they kept Greece unconquered, and they left behind a record in art and thought, which in all the centuries of human effort since has not been surpassed. The point which I want to make is not that their taste was superior to ours, not that the Parthenon was their idea of church architecture, nor that Sophocles was the great drawing card in the theaters, nor any of the familiar comparisons between 5th century Athens and 20th century America, but that Socrates found on every street corner and in every Athenian the equivalent of the baseball field, people who were caught up by his questions into the world of thought. To be able to be caught up into the world of thought, that is to be educated. How is that great aim to be reached? For years, we've eagerly discussed ways and means of education, and the discussion still goes on. William James once said that there were two subjects which, if I mentioned, other conversations stop and directed all eyes to the speaker. Religion was one, and education the other. Today, Russia seems to come first, but education is still emphatically the second. In spite of all the articles we read and all the speeches we listen to about it, we want to know more. We feel deeply its importance. There is today a clearly visible trend toward making it the aim of education to defeat the Russians. That would be a sure way to defeat education. Genuine education is possible only when people realize it has to do with persons, not with movements. When I read educational articles, it often seems to me that this important side of the matter, the purely personal side, is not emphasized enough. The fact the fact that it is so much more agreeable and interesting to be an educated person than not. The sheer pleasure of being educated does not seem to be stressed. Once long ago, I was talking with Professor Basil L. Gildersleeve of Johns Hopkins University, the greatest Greek scholar our country has produced. He was an old man, and he had been honored everywhere in Europe as well as America. He was just back from a celebration held for him in Oxford. I asked him what compliment received in his long life had pleased him most. The question amused him, and he laughed over it, but he thought too. And finally he said, I believe it was when one of my students said, Professor, you have so much fun with your own mind. Robert Louis Stevenson said that a man ought to be able to spend 2 or 3 hours waiting for a train at a little country station when he was all alone and had nothing to read and not be bored for a moment. What is the education which can do this? What is the furniture which makes the only place belonging absolutely to each one of us, the world within, a place where we like to go? I wish I could answer that question. I wish I could produce a perfect decorator's design, warranted to make any interior lovely and interesting and stimulating, but even if I could, sooner or later, we would certainly try different designs. My point is only that while we must and should change the furniture, we ought to throw away old furniture very carefully, very cautiously. It may turn out to be irreplaceable. A great deal was thrown away in the last generation or so, long enough ago to show some of the results. Furniture which had for centuries been foremost, we lightly, in a few years, discarded. Classics almost vanished from our field of education. That was a great change. Along with it came another. There is a marked difference between the writers of the past and the writers of today who have been educated without benefit of Greek and Latin. Is this a matter of cause and effect? People will decide for themselves, but I do not think anyone will question the statement that clear thinking is not the characteristic which distinguishes our literature today. We are more and more caught up by the unintelligible. People like it. This argues an inability to think, or almost as bad, a disinclination to think. Neither disposition marked the Greeks. They had a passion for thinking things out, and they loved unclouded clarity of statement as well as of thought. The Romans did too, in their degree. They were able to put an idea into an astonishingly small number of words without losing a particle of intelligibility. It is only of late, with a generation which has never had to deal with a Latin sentence, that we're being submerged in a flood of words. It has been said that Lincoln at Gettysburg today would have begun in some fashion as this: 8 7/10 decades ago, the pioneer workers in this continental area implemented a new group based on an ideology of free boundaries and initial equality, and might easily have ended, that political supervision of the integrated units for the integrated units by the integrated units shall not become null and void on the superficial area of this planet. Along with the banishment of the classics, gobbledygook has come upon us, and the appalling size of the congressional record and the overburdened mail service. Just what the teaching in schools was, which laid the foundation of the Greek civilization, we do not know in detail. The results, we do know. Greek children were taught, Plato said, to, quote, love what is beautiful and hate what is ugly, unquote. When they grew up, their very pots and pans had to be pleasant to look at. It was part of their training to hate clumsiness and awkwardness. They loved grace, and they practiced it. Quote, our children, Plato said, will be influenced for good by every sight and sound of beauty, breathing in, as it were, a pure breeze blowing to them from a good land, unquote. All the same, the Athenians were not, as they showed Socrates when he talked to them, preoccupied with enjoying lovely things. The children were taught to think. Plato demanded a stiff examination, especially in mathematics, for entrance into his academy. The Athenians were a thinking people. Today, the scientists are bearing away the prize for thought. Well, a Greek said that the Earth went around the sun 16 centuries before Copernicus thought of it. A Greek said if you sailed out of Spain and you kept it to one latitude, you would come at last to land 1,700 years before Columbus did it. Darwin said, we are mere schoolboys in scientific thinking compared to old Aristotle. And the Greeks did not have a great legacy from the past, as our scientists have. They thought science out from the beginning. The same is true for politics. They thought that out too from the beginning, and they gave all the boys a training to fit them to be thinking citizens of a free state that had come into being through thought. Basic to all the Greek achievement was freedom. The Athenians were the only free people in the world. In the great empires of antiquity, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, splendid though they were, with riches beyond reckoning and immense power, freedom was unknown. The idea of it never dawned in any of them. It was born in Greece, a poor little country, but with it, able to remain unconquered no matter what manpower and what wealth were arrayed against her. At Marathon and at Salamis, overwhelming numbers of Persians had been defeated by small Greek forces. It had been proved that one free man was superior to many submissively obedient subjects of a tyrant. Athens was the leader in that amazing victory, and to the Athenians, freedom was their dearest possession. Demosthenes said that they would not think it worth their while to live if they could not do so as free men. And years later, a great teacher said, Athenians, if you deprive them of their liberty, will die. Athens was not only the first democracy in the world, it was also, at its height, an almost perfect democracy. That is, for men. There was no part in it for women or foreigners or slaves. But as far as the men were concerned, it was more democratic than we are. The governing body was the assembly, of which all citizens over 18 were members. The Council of 500, which prepared business for the assembly and, if requested, carried out what had been decided there, was made up of citizens who were chosen by lot. The same was true of the juries. Minor officials were also chosen by lot. The chief magistrates and the highest officers in the army were elected by the assembly. Pericles was a general, very popular, who acted for a long time as if he were the head of the state, but he had to be elected every year. Freedom of speech was the right the Athenians prized most. And there has never been another state as free in that respect. When toward the end of the terrible Peloponnesian War, the victorious Spartans were advancing upon Athens, Aristophanes caricatured in the theater the leading Athenian generals and showed them up as cowards. And even then, as the assembly opened, the herald asked, "Does anyone wish to speak?" There was complete political equality. It was a government of the people, by the people, for the people. An unregenerate old aristocrat in the early 4th century BC writes, quote, "If you must have a democracy, Athens is the perfect example. I object to it because it is based on the welfare of the lower, not the better, classes. In Athens, the people who row the vessels and do the work have the advantage. It is their prosperity that is important." Unquote. All the same, making the city beautiful was important too, as were also the great performances in the theater. If, as Plato says, the assembly was chiefly made up of cobblers and carpenters and smiths and farmers and retail businessmen, they approved the construction of the Parthenon and the other buildings on the Acropolis, and they crowded the theater when the great tragedies were played. Not only did all free men share in the government, the love of the beautiful and the desire to have a part in creating it were shared by the many, not by a mere chosen few. That has happened in no state except Athens. But those free Greeks owned slaves. What kind of freedom was that? The question would have been incomprehensible to the ancient world. There had always been slaves. They were a first necessity. The way of life everywhere was based upon them. They were taken for granted. No one ever gave them a thought. The very best Greek minds, the thinkers who discovered freedom and the solar system, had never an idea that slavery was evil. It is true that the greatest thinker of them all, Plato, was made uncomfortable by it. He said that slaves were often good, trustworthy, doing more for a man than his own family would, but he did not follow his thought through. The glory of being the first one to condemn it belongs to a man of the generations before Plato, the poet Euripides. He called it that thing of evil, and in several of his tragedies showed its evil for all to see. A few centuries later, the great Greek school of the Stoics denounced it. Greece first saw it for what it is, but the world went on in the same way. The Bible accepts it without comment. 2,000 years after the Stoics, less than 100 years ago, the American Republic accepted it. Athens treated her slaves well. A visitor to the city in the early 4th century BC wrote, quote, "It is illegal here to deal a slave a blow. In the street he won't step aside to let you pass. Indeed, you can't tell a slave by his dress. He looks like all the rest. They can go to the theater too. Really, the Athenians have established a kind of equality between slaves and free men," unquote. They were never a possible source of danger to the state as they were in Rome. There were no terrible slave wars and uprisings in Athens. In Rome, crucifixion was called the slave's punishment. The Athenians did not practice crucifixion and had no so-called slave's punishment. They were not afraid of their slaves. In Athens' great prime, Athenians were free. No one told them what they must do or what they should think. No church or political party or powerful private interests or labor unions. Greek schools had no donors of endowments they must pay attention to. No government financial backing which must be made secure by acting as the government wanted. To be sure, the result was that they had to take full responsibility. But that is always the price for full freedom. The Athenians were a strong people. They could pay that price. They were a thinking people. They knew what freedom means. They knew not that they were free because their country was free, but that their country was free because they were free. A reflective Roman, traveling in Greece in the 2nd century AD, said, quote, "None ever throve under democracy save the Athenians. They had sane self-control and were law-abiding." Unquote. He spoke truly. That is what Athenian education aimed at. To produce men who would be able to maintain a self-governed state because they were themselves self-governed, self-controlled, self-reliant. Plato speaks of the education in excellence which makes men long to be perfect citizens, knowing both how to rule and to be ruled. Pericles said, "We are a free democracy. We do not allow absorption in our own affairs to interfere with participation in the cities. We yield to none. In independence of spirit and complete self-reliance. But we regard him who holds aloof from public affairs as useless." Unquote. They called the useless man a private citizen, idiotes, from which our word idiot comes. They had risen to freedom and to ennoblement from what Gilbert Murray calls effortless barbarism. They saw it all around them. They hated its filth and fierceness. Nothing effortless was among the good things that they wanted. Plato said, "Hard is the good." And a poet of hundreds of years before Plato said, "Before the gates of excellence the high gods have placed sweat. Long is the road thereto, and steep and rough at the first, but when the height is won, then there is ease." When or why the Greeks set themselves to travel on the road, we do not know. But it led them away from habits and customs accepted everywhere that kept men down to barbaric filth and fierceness. It led them far. One example is enough to show the way they took. It was the custom, during how many millenniums, who can say, for a victor to erect a trophy, a monument of his victory. In Egypt, where stone was plentiful, it would be a slab engraved with his glories. Farther east, where the sand took over, it might be a great heap of severed heads. Quite permanent objects. Bones last a long time. But in Greece, though a man could erect a trophy, it must be made of wood, and it could never be repaired. Even as the victor set it up, he would see in his mind how soon it would decay and sink into ruin, and there it must be left. The Greeks, in their onward pressing along the steep and rough road, had learned a great deal. They knew the victor might be the vanquished next time. There should be no permanent records of the manifestly impermanent. They had learned a great deal. An old Greek inscription states that the aim of mankind should be, quote, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world, unquote. Aristotle said that the city was built first for safety, but then that men might discover the good life and lead it. So the Athenians did, according to Pericles. Pericles said that Athens stood for freedom and for thought and for beauty, but in the Greek way, within limits, without exaggeration. The Athenians loved beauty, he said, but with simplicity. They did not like the extravagances of luxury. They loved the things of the mind, but they did not shrink from hardship. Thought did not cause them to hesitate. It clarified the road to action. If they had riches, they did not make a show of them, and no one was ashamed of being poor if he was useful. They were free because of willing obedience to law, not only the written, but still more the unwritten. Kindness and compassion and unselfishness and the many qualities which cannot be enforced, which depend on a man's free choice, but without which men cannot live together. If there is to be a truly good and great and enduring republic, it must be along these lines. We need the challenge of the city that thought them out, wherein for centuries one genius after another grew up. Geniuses are not produced by spending money. We need the challenge of the way of the Greeks were educated. They fixed their eyes on the individual. We contemplate millions. What we have undertaken in the matter of education has dawned upon us only lately. We're trying to do what has never been attempted before, never in the history of the world. Educate all the young in a nation of 170 millions? A magnificent idea. But we're beginning to realize what are the problems and what may be the results of mass production of education. So far, we do not seem appalled at the prospect of exactly the same kind of education being applied to all the school children from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but there is an uneasiness in the air, a realization that the individual is growing less easy to find. An idea, perhaps, of what standardization might become when the units are not machines, but human beings. Here is where we can go back to the Greeks with profit. The Athenians, in the dangerous world, needed to be a nation of independent men who could take responsibility, and they taught their children accordingly. They thought about every boy. Someday he would be a citizen of Athens, responsible for her safety and her glory. Each one, Pericles said, fitted to meet life's chances and changes with the utmost versatility and grace. To them, education was, by its very nature, an individual matter. To be properly educated, a boy had to be taught music. He learned to play a musical instrument. He had to learn poetry, a great deal of it, and recite it. And there were a number of musical instruments and many poets, though to be sure, Homer was the great textbook. That kind of education is not geared to mass production. It does not produce people who instinctively go the same way. That is how Athenian children lived and learned, while our millions learn the same lessons and spend hours before television sets looking at exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. For one reason and another, we are more and more ignoring differences, if not trying to obliterate them. We seem headed toward a standardization of the mind, what Goethe called the deadly commonplace that fetters us all. That was not the Greek way. The picture of the age of Pericles drawn by the historian Thucydides, one of the greatest historians the world has known, is of a state made up of people who are self-reliant individuals, not echoes or copies who want to be let alone to do their own work, but who are also closely bound together by a great aim. The common weal, each one so in love with his country, Pericles' own words, that he wants most of all to use himself in her service. Only an ideal? Ideals have enormous power. They stamp an age. They lift life up when they're lofty, and they drag down and make decadent when they're low. And then, by that strange fact, the survival of the fittest, those who are low fade away and are forgotten. The Greek ideals have had a power of persistent life for 2,500 years. Is it rational that now, when the young people may have to face problems harder than we face, is it reasonable that with the atomic age before them at this time, we are giving up the study of how the Greeks and Romans prevailed magnificently in a barbaric world? The study, too, of how that triumph ended? How a slackness and softness finally came over them to their ruin? In the end, more than they wanted freedom, they wanted security, a comfortable life, and they lost all security and comfort and freedom. Is not that a challenge to us? Is it not true that into our education have come a slackness and softness? Is hard effort prominent? The world of thought can be entered in no other way. Are we not growing slack and soft in our political life? When the Athenians finally wanted not to give to the state, but the state to give to them, when the freedom they wished most for was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again. Is not that a challenge? Cicero said, quote, "To be ignorant of the past is to remain a child." Santayana said, "A nation that does not know history is fated to repeat it." The Greeks can help us as no other people can, to see how freedom is won and how it is lost. Above all, to see in clearest light what freedom is. The first nation in the world to be free sends a ringing call down through the centuries to all who would be free. Greece rose to the very height, not because she was big, she was very small. Not because she was rich, she was very poor. And not even because she was wonderfully gifted. So doubtless were others in the great empires of the ancient world who have gone their way, leaving little for us. She rose because there was in the Greeks the greatest spirit that moves in humanity. The spirit that sets men free. Plato put it into words what that spirit is. Freedom, he says, is no matter of laws and constitutions, Only he is free who realizes the divine order within himself, the true standard by which a man can steer and measure himself. True standards, ideals that lift life up, marked the way of the Greeks. Therefore, their light has never been extinguished. Quote, "The time for extracting a lesson from history is ever at hand for them who are wise," unquote, said Demosthenes.